Hi, we turn to 1 Samuel 21 as David comes to Nob to the priest Ahimelech after having entered into a covenant with Saul's son Jonathan and having been protected by Saul's daughter, David's wife, Michal. And one of the many things we're going to have to look at in this section is why is David coming here and why is he doing what he's doing? And to look at those details, we need to step back and ask the bigger questions of what the authors of this story are doing in portraying a whole series of chapters of Saul chasing after David and eventually, by the end of the book, Saul dying in battle and David taking his place as king. So to reflect on that, I'd like to invite us to consider what is it in our cultural context that leads us to be empathetic to people like Vito Corleone or Tony Soprano. In other words, mobsters who we know are murderers and often greedy and are selfish and violent in many ways, and yet we root for them, don't we? Vito Corleone is certainly someone who everybody's on the side of when we watch The Godfather, and perhaps Tony Soprano as well, although he's not quite the same kind of character as Vito Corleone. And one of the ways that writers or in films, screenwriters and directors who can do a lot more than we can just a plain text like in the Bible here can do, is to generate a sense of empathy by showing them as a victim by showing them as a victim of injustice or acting on behalf of those in need, the marginalized and such, as we see, especially in Godfather 2, where the young Vito Corleone protects one of his friends from the Black Hand Man and protects his job. And then people start to come to him and see him as a good guy. And as his power continues and he consolidates his power, we're still carrying that rosy sense in the beginning of he's a good guy, isn't he? Perhaps even the same with a character who's not a mobster like a Walter White from Breaking Bad, who starts off as an ordinary high school chemistry teacher, an ordinary guy, and yet we saw that he later in Breaking Bad that he was ripped off by his former partners who got rich at his expense, and so we're rooting for him to make a living being a meth dealer, even though that involves engaging with the Mexican cartel. And eventually, by the time Breaking Bad is over, and perhaps by the time The Godfather's over, few viewers have empathy for Vito's son Michael or for Walter. And we'll see what the situation is by the time we get to the end of the story of King David after his family falls apart after the Bathsheba and Uriah incident. But for now, the author is trying to establish, I'd like to suggest, a sense of empathy by portraying Saul increasingly as paranoid and plainly not Yahweh's choice of king, and David as either protected from Yahweh or at least making choices that enable him to take his stand when Saul is finally done persecuting him. So that's one way to look at it, and I note that many readers, both ordinary readers and scholarly readers, have preconceived ideas about David that they bring into these scenes. So in the immediate scene we're going to look at when he talks to the priest Ahimelech in the town of Nob, do we assume that David is speaking plain truth or this is deceptive, and what are the motivations? And even though character forms as we continue to read the story, and the best way to understand the character of David would be to read the entire story and come back. Of course, I've done that, and maybe you have, but maybe you haven't. Maybe you're just following this, or maybe you're just picking one random video to look at because you were concerned with this scene. I don't know. But one element of character in a long overarching story like this one, or like a many episode, many season TV show, is that when we're in this point of the story, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But here we can know what's going to happen. We can know ahead what happens with David as king and read the character we find there back into our story here. Or can we? Is the character we see later only developed later, or was it there all along? And that goes into the unanswerable psychological questions of human life, of whether we can really change and what is our true self and how much of that is from God and how much are we making choices. And I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but it is important to recognize that part of what's at issue in this entire narrative isn't just the simple fact that the story claims that through Samuel, Yahweh chose David as king, the end, but that the battle to be king relies on the support of a large number of people, whether that's the elite in the royal city, in this case at the moment Saul's hometown of Gibeah, or others along the way. So in these chapters as they unfold, starting in chapter 21, we're going to see David beginning to form an alternative network of allegiance that when the time comes for him to take the throne is ready. But that time is not yet. So as we enter into this, as you can see on the right side of the screen, I have the larger chiastic structure of 1 Samuel 15:10 through the end of the book up here. And right now we're moving into this section here, the encounter at Ahimelech's, and it'll include David's fleeing to King Achish of Gath, and then the flip side down here when David is among the Philistines as a vassal to King Achish. And throughout this whole thing, we can see that it will end with the physical death of Saul and Jonathan, and the rejection of the Philistines, rejection of David David by the Philistines. And so even though he'll be shown working with them, one of the questions we'll have to ask is, what is David's relationship with the Philistines before he's able to take the throne? And we're also going to see a number of places where he hides, and we can see that here in this sequence of scenes in these first few chapters. And really, chapter 21 and 22 are a unit, because the section we're going to see right now with David and Ahimelech will come back with Saul and Ahimelech, and that also includes Doeg, the assassin that Saul will use to kill 85 priests and the entire town of Nob when we get to chapter 22. And really, chapter 23 follows slightly different from that, with this pursuit in the town of Keilah. But when we get to 24 to 25 and 26, we'll see another unit, because 24 and 26 are very similar stories of David encountering Saul in a cave and not killing him. And 25 is the amazing story of David and Nabal, and Nabal's wife Abigail, who turns out to be one of David's wives, as we'll see. So we're going to focus here on the beginning of the story, and there are a number of questions that I want to put out there. I'm not going to be able to answer all of these, but just to get our gears turning around the nature of the story, because there's certainly much more going on than meets the eyes. So what is the writer's purpose? I was already trying to address the suggestion that it could be for empathy for David in opposition to Saul, or is it a holy theological purpose to show that David, having been chosen by Yahweh, is always protected by Yahweh, no matter what Saul does to try to kill him? Or is it simply entertainment from some later time to tell suspenseful stories with a deeper motive, perhaps, but like the current cultural stories I was suggesting, The Godfather or Breaking Bad, to entertain an audience with stories of violence and suspense? And those are not mutually exclusive, then or now. Why does David go to Nob? And that's a question we're going to ask all the way through, that scholars can often, and readers can often, just take as a given that David does what he does. But Jonathan having gone to the city and them having made a covenant, why does he go here? And what is his strategy? We don't hear what David's internal workings are, so we have to infer that. He has allies now in the house of Saul, which is certainly dangerous to Saul's continuation, that his daughter and son have sided with David, but that's not going to be enough to secure the throne for him. So one of the elements we're going to see is David gathering, and perhaps he's starting here by gathering the priesthood on his side. In the dialogue we have with them, what is really going on? It appears to be about bread, and the difference between showbread, the holy bread, and ordinary bread. And then it appears to be about weapons, and the sword of Goliath is there. But the sword of Goliath is never mentioned again, and the showbread in the scene is only mentioned in the New Testament, when Jesus in the Synoptic Gospel uses it as an example for why he can violate the Sabbath and pick grain on the Sabbath. But we're not going to get into that element of it. So we have to make a decision as readers based on the story in this immediate scene, but also based on the wider sense we have of who David is and what the writers are doing, of what's really going on here. And who is being deceived? Is David deceiving Ahimelech, or David and Ahimelech quietly conspiring to deceive Doeg, who we find out in the middle of the story is there listening? Who are the young men that Ahimelech assumes are with David? Because we hear at the beginning, trembling, Ahimelech asks, "Why are you alone?" And yet he refers to the young men, and yet they're not there. So who are these young men that Ahimelech assumes are with David? Why the holy or showbread? He says there are 5 loaves, and we say loaf, we're talking about like a pita bread. Yet there are 85 priests in a whole town, so there must be more bread, mustn't there? And why this question of the showbread? Why is Doeg introduced in the middle of the dialogue, just placed there, that we know he's there, but he has no role here, but he'll have quite a role in chapter 22. So what is the effect on us as readers of finding out that he's there in the middle of the discussion? What is Goliath's sword doing hidden in a cloth at Nob? Back in chapter 17, when David defeated Goliath, and he took the sword, we had no word about what happened to it, and now it's hidden here behind the ephod, held by a priest in a cloth in Nob. What is it doing there? What else might be in Ahimelech's secret treasury there? We don't know. And it's never mentioned again. So if it was meant to be a weapon, David certainly doesn't use it. And as we saw back in chapter 17, Goliath's a spear was as big as a weaver's beam, so his sword must have been equally large, fitting his stature. And since Saul's weapons were too big for David to carry, certainly Goliath's would. So why Goliath's sword? When the scene is over, why does David leave Nob and do the strange thing of going to the Philistine king Achish of Gath? And I note in advance here that the Philistines are otherwise describing as having a shared leadership of 5, quote, lords of the Philistines, and yet this is the only named king we see. So why King Achish, and why does he go there only to feign insanity when he's recognized by Achish's men? After leaving Gath, he goes to another place and hides in the cave of Adullam. And each of these things, no motivation is given. Out of all the places, and we'll look at the Bible Atlas in a moment to see where we are, but of all the places to go, we don't know why he's going to these places, and yet there's some reason, so we have to try to work on that. And how are all the locations and intentions being conveyed together? I'll show you in a minute a chart of all the various rumors and indirect communication going on in these chapters. But across the distances we'll look at in the Bible Atlas, how are we supposed to imagine this communication is happening? It's not like they can send a text or an email. It takes a long time to go back and forth. And how would people in one place know what is happening in another place in order to inform David and or Saul? Then, as we move on, David gathers a group of 400 of the oppressed and marginalized, but he goes to Mizpah of Moab to do that. And why there? Some scholars have suggested that because of the book of Ruth, that David's ancestry is Moabite, but we don't know that in this story, and we don't know when Ruth was written in relation to these stories, probably later, so we don't know the connection there. And then suddenly there's the prophet Gad, like we know him, but we don't know him, and he's only in this one scene, and we never see him again, other than a reference at the very end of the book. So what is he doing there? Then after Gad tells David to go into the land of Judah, why does David go to the forest of Hereth, which is in that land, but why that particular place when Gad just said generally the land of Judah? First time we hear about the land of Judah, but we'll get there when we get there. In the next scene, when we have Saul raging paranoiacally at his gathered servants, why are you all conspiring against me? Why is it that Doeg reports on David's meeting? And we'll also look at how his report isn't exactly accurate to what we saw earlier. And when Saul questions Ahimelech, why does Ahimelech stand up for his relationship with David, almost certainly knowing it's going to get him killed, when he had a way of getting out of that? And then finally, and something that I find amazing that I did not find any scholar who grapples with this, how are we supposed to imagine one person, Doeg, single-handedly killing 85 priests and then all the women and children and animals in the town of Nob while one escapes? He doesn't have a machine gun to mow them down. It has to be by sword, one at a time. And it's a crazy scene. Why don't they just run away? Why don't they just attack him? There's no implication at all that there's anybody there except him, especially since those described as Saul's servants refused to do it. So those are some questions over the next two chapters we're going to get at, and I'll come back to this as we go. But as we enter into that, I want to show the two things I was just noting, the rumors and indirect communication here. And I left this one out because the ones in blue are message to Saul and the green are message to David. And this is one to Ashash that we see right there. And we don't have a lot of them in our immediate scene, but we sure have a lot of these in the chapters that follow. So I want to highlight that theme as we go here, that there's an enormous amount of people here that other people are there, or they learn, or they know, and how is that all happening? And then finally, to give us a sense of direction, they had been in Gibeah and Saul's place here, and we can see all the various places around there. Although Nob is presented here on the map like it's a specific place, actually scholars have little knowledge of the city of Nob, and there's no archaeological certainty of where it is. But they're guessing it's near here because that's simply where they are. Notice it's placed here near Jebus, which is not Jerusalem yet. It doesn't become David's city of Jerusalem until 2 Samuel 5. But Bethlehem, David's hometown, is down here, and Gath, where he's going to go after this scene, is here, and Adullam, where the cave is there, and Keilah, with the city that he'll defend, is there, and eventually the wilderness of Sif and the oasis of En-Gadi are down here. So with all that introduction, we're not going to go too far into our passage today. We're just going to look at the first couple of verses here in chapter 21 to get a feel for why some of those questions I asked need to be asked, so we can get a feel for the instability of the certainty of, are people speaking the truth, or is there some kind of coded language going on that only David and Ahimelech understand? Or is it language only David understands? Let's look and find out. So David came to Nob, and as I've noted, Alter suggests less than 3 miles south of Gibeah, fitting the map here, although as a matter of fact, we don't know that exactly. A number of people, including Pamela Reese, who's done a lot of work on this scene here, notes that the description, David came to Nob to the priest Ahimelech, is the opposite of what we saw in 19:18. He came to Samuel in Ramah, highlighting that in chapter 19, the key was he was coming to Samuel, and Ramah happened to be where Samuel was, whereas here he's coming to Nob, and the priest Ahimelech is one of the people in Nob. And that'll be really important, as we'll see, since it's the town of Nob in chapter 22 that is destroyed by Saul's agent Doeg. And to the priest Ahimelech, And as you can see in my note below, priest is a key word here, used a number of times in this section, and again at 22:11. And yet we'll see Ahimelech is sometimes called the priest Ahimelech a couple times, and then simply the priest, but he'll also be called Ahimelech around the question of the sword. So the narrator is doing something there by highlighting either his role as priest or his person as actually then someone named Ahimelech. And the name Ahimelech, which interestingly means my brother is king, and what that would have to do with this situation here, we don't know. It comes to David trembling. And we've seen trembling earlier here, and as my note below from Fackelman suggests, the source of Ahimelech's anxiety is none other than the source of anxiety in 16:4, where we were told with the same expression that the elders of Bethlehem were awaiting Samuel in alarm. It is a shadow of Saul over the land. It is the terror side of the royal power. And yet he's trembling about what he names here. Why are you alone and no one with you? And this is where Pamela Reese really has some insights. In her article from 1994 that I cite below, she notes how some traditional interpretations leave some gaps unexplained in the story, and hers is the only one I've seen that really accounts for all the details. And although it's almost 30 years old, I've seen nothing that offers anything better. So I'm going to be relying a lot on her work in this section here. So he asks two questions which seem to be the same question, and she infers something interesting from that. Why are you alone and no one with you? And as she says down below, Ahimelech's words are, quoting her, ingenious. They inform David that Ahimelech, a typo there, it's Ahimelech, not Abimelech, is not alone, and yet appears completely innocuous and perfectly consistent with the priest's feigned assumption that David is still Saul's officer. The second phrase, and no one with you, emphasizing David's unattended state, imparts to David himself so prudent in speech and sensitive to nuance that he's uniquely solitary, unlike the priest. In other words, what Reese is assuming here is that David and Ahimelech are quietly conspiring here because Ahimelech knows what David must see, but readers don't know yet that Doeg is there listening and Doeg isn't trustworthy. So he's highlighting the fact that why are you alone, given that I'm not alone, and that therefore I can't speak openly, like perhaps in so many TV shows where somebody's on the phone and they're saying something strange, and the person on one of the lines says, "You can't speak clearly, can you?" And they says, "No, I can't." But the people at that end don't know exactly what he's saying. So we can imagine that kind of interaction here, where David is trying to understand what Ahimelech is saying, and Ahimelech understanding what David's saying. But they can't have planned this out because they can't have known that Doeg was there, and we have no reason to know that David knows Ahimelech from anything earlier or has ever been to Nob before. What he certainly seems to be doing is trying to gather some kind of support from the priesthood. This is, as we'll find out, a town of priests with 85 of them there. So David said to the priest Ahimelech, and notice it's highlighting that again here, priest Ahimelech, and we'll see that a number of times. The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, no one must know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young man for such and such a place. And we as readers, without yet knowing that Doeg is there, have to know that's a fabrication. And one of the issues that scholars grapple with is, in the immediate narrative context, the king would be Saul. But is that what's going on? As Poulsen notes following Fackelman below, the king who sends David out is God. But is that what David has in mind? That he's giving a coded message to Ahimelech that he's doing God's will? Or is it the coded message that's a lie that he's doing Saul's will? Given he doesn't say what it is and says it's a secret, and then gives this very vague thing, I've made an appointment with the young man for such and such a place, as Bodner notes, the Hebrew expression is used to designate an intentionally ambiguous place or person. And there's more about it that makes it suspicious. The very phrasing here, no one must know anything of the matter about which I send you, supposedly a quote from the king, and of which I've charged you. But what kind of matter could it be that the king is sending David, who's well known, in fact, we'll see in the next scene, the Philistines know, for killing his tens of thousands? What would be such a secret? And the point is, the secret is between David and Ahimelech. There is no mission from Saul, although there is obviously a mission from Yahweh to become king. And so as our story unfolds here, what we're noting is we have to pay careful attention when the next piece of the scene unfolds around the bread. Is the bread part of the coded message here? And there are many hints that it is, given that David asked specifically for 5 loaves, a symbolic amount, and it's only for him, and yet there's an implication of other young men around, even though they're not visible in the scene. So with that introduction, I'll stop here, and we'll pick up the question of holy bread versus other bread in our next video. See you then. Bye-bye.